Hey, good day. This is Rhonda reading The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Today I'm reading Part 1, The Discovery of a Lost Gospel. Finding the Shards. In modern times, adventurers, seekers of treasure, and archaeologists have discovered many ancient writings in ruins, caves, and old monastery libraries. Some of these finds have been early manuscripts of well-known writings, such as the biblical texts discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery in the 1850s or at the Qumran in the 1940s. Others have been texts of writing, excuse me, known only by the title because of some mention by an ancient author, but were thought to have been lost, forgotten, or burned in the creedal wars of the 4th and 5th centuries. Examples are the discovery of the Epistle of Barnabas at St. Catherine's in 1859 and Didache, or teaching, I hope I said that right, of the 12 apostles. In the Patriarchal Library of Constantinople in 1875, others have come as complete surprises, such as many of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the ancient library at Qumran and the Coptic Gnostic Library at Nag Hammadi, discovered during the 1940s. In the quest to reconstruct the past, every new textual discovery has been greeted with some measure of enthusiasm, and many finds have created sensations. New texts are exciting to scholars because of their promise of new knowledge and enticing to others because of a sense that hidden secrets are about to be disclosed. In the case of Q's discovery, however, there have been no announcement, little public excitement, and no sense that anything secret was about to be revealed. That is because Q was not discovered in some ancient cache. A manuscript of Q entitled The Sayings of Jesus did not suddenly come to light. Instead, the bits and pieces of this ancient writing were found scattered about in the Gospels of the New Testament. And these were very familiar texts. It was by chance, in the course of tracking down the layered traditions of these Gospels, that Q slowly emerged. Its existence at the bedrock of the Jesus traditions traditionally forced itself upon scholars who hardly noticed the momentous significance of their discovery because the material was already so well known. The idea there must have been a text like Q was first thought of over 150 years ago, but its recognition as a document with its own distinctive history had to wait for the present generation of scholars. One reason it took so long is that New Testament scholars have been haunted by the desire to reconstruct the life, quote unquote, of Jesus. They were therefore preoccupied with the eventual aspects of Gospels, worried about their miraculous features, not about the teachings, which they took for granted. Another reason is that since Q referred to a written source that was used in slightly different ways by the two independent authors, Matthew and Luke, reconstructing a single unified text for study and discussion was at first thought to be impossible. And a third reason is that many New Testament scholars resisted the idea of Q because they thought there was no other example of the genre in early Christian literature, thus could not imagine why early Christians would have written such a text. However, as the comparative study of the Gospels unfolded, the nature of Jesus' teaching eventually became a critical question. Ways to reconstruct the text of Q were developed. Another example of the genre was found the sayings gospel known as the Gospel of Thomas. And scholars finally turn to the question about Q's composition and content. A brief exploration of the major moments in this long history of scholarship helps in understanding how and why Q finally emerged from the pages of the narrative Gospels to challenge their own account of Christian origins. In this chapter, the story of Q's discovery as a written text will be told. In the next three chapters, the current scholarly excitement about recognizing Q's genre and importance for reconstructing the history of Christian origins will be described. The story starts early in the 19th century, the century known for its quest for the historical Jesus. The quest made possible by the rational methods of historical criticism learned in the Age of Enlightenment, but it was driven by a thoroughly romantic Protestant obsession. Protestant critique of the Catholic Church claimed that Catholic religion was a pagan adulteration of true Christianity. In order to define true Christianity, Protestant reformers at first located its truth in the scriptures as a way to counter Catholic emphasis on post biblical tradition as equal in importance for Christian faith and practice. But as the Enlightenment dawned, other strategies commended themselves. What if Catholic Christianity could be shown as a historical development that veered away from the original intentions of Jesus and the earliest form of Christian community and faith? Then the Protestant case would be made. The essence of Christianity would be obvious from the pristine purity of its original form, and Protestant claims to represent the true form of Christianity would have to be acknowledged. So the quest for this historical Jesus was motivated by a Protestant desire to leapfrog over the entire history of Catholic Christianity and land at the beginning where, as it was imagined, the foundations of Christianity had been laid in the life and purpose of its founder. The problem with this undertaking was that the only records of Jesus' life were the four Gospels of the New Testament. At first, Protestant scholars thought it was enough to note the contrast between the Jesus of the Gospel accounts and history of pagan, quote unquote, iconograph- icon, iconography and worship in Catholic religion. But Catholics had no trouble with the Gospels. They had already read them as records of the very events that inspired their religion. Mary was there, and the story of the virgin birth. The miracles were there, both in public appearance of Jesus and in great events that confirmed the significance of his life: the baptism, transfiguration, crucifixion, and resurrection. Peter was there, as were the 12 apostles, Mary Magdalene, and the Great Commission to make disciples of all the nations. And there was ample instruction in faith, forgiveness, obedience, and the final judgment. So Protestant scholars had to take another look. Upon a close, excuse me, upon a closer reading of the Gospels, they had to agree that the Gospels contained a good bit of mythology and too many miracles for comfort. This then set the agenda for more than 100 years of detailed investigation. The goal of the quest would be to get behind the myths and miracles of the Gospels and reconstruct the story of the man as he really was. In retrospect, it seems strange that no one thought to question the main storyline that resulted from a merger of the four Gospels. The very outline of the life of Christ that all Christians had in mind, but this was because no one imagined that the evangelists, as the authors of the Gospels were called during the 19th century, had intended anything other than a biography. A biography of such an important person's life is exactly what a 19th century scholar would have expected of a first century writer. The problem was that the evangelists lived in pre Enlightenment times, which meant they were uncritical, quote unquote, and they must have been a bit gullible about the causes of certain events and somewhat mistaken about many of the details. Notice that no two evangelists agreed exactly in their descriptions of the same events, and that all of them had trouble their histories free from the. Thus, the major issues were set. The quest of the historical Jesus would swirl around the issues of one, miracles, and two, the fact that the four accounts did not agree in detail. A discussion of the efforts to remove the sheen of the miraculous from the gospel accounts is not directly relevant to the discovery of Q. Excuse me. That is because Q was uncovered in the course of comparing the four Gospels to see which may have been the earliest, not by any of the attempts to explain away the miracles. Nevertheless, because the furor over the miracles frequently drowned out the more laborious quest for the earliest Gospel, this background helps clarify why it took so long to recognize Q. The raging battle over the miracles simply overwhelmed Enlightenment scholars and resulted in the studies that created sensations. From John Locke's little book on the reasonableness of Christianity, boy, I can't talk this morning. The Reasonableness of Christianity, 1695, through David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus in 1835 to Albert Schweitzer's The Quest of the Historical Jesus in 1906. A book that summed up the century, the quest was the same: how to explain the miracles. Locke thought that even though reports of miracles in general could not be believed, the miracles of Jesus may actually have happened because they were so unusual, unrepeatable, and unique. Others thought that the common people imagined the miracles because they were so infatuated with this special man. Strauss and others wrote thousands of pages explaining the miracles away as illusions, legends, and myths. Strauss noted that they accrued in the course of early Christian attempts to say how important Jesus' appearance had been. Thus, preoccupied with such a quest, scholars found it difficult to concentrate on the question of which gospel was written first. All of the Gospels seem to have so many miracles, and getting rid of the miracles seemed to be the highest on the list of priorities if one wanted to get to the life of the man as he really was. And yet, like a Chinese puzzle, the question of which gospel was the first to be written kept teasing the more critical minds. All scholars agreed that one of the four had to be the first, and most scholars had their favorite to propose. The problem was that arguments supporting the priority of one or the other gospel were so difficult to find. The problem could only be resolved by a rigorous study that used a single set of critical criteria to compare the four with one another. Johann Griesbach provided the tool to do this in his synopsis of the first three Gospels, published in 1776. Griesbach recognized that the fourth Gospel was distinctly different from the first three. In this gospel, Jesus sounded like a passionless God on a temporary mission from another world, merely frustrated with the ignorance of humankind in a dull world. The ethereal tone of Jesus' voice in the Gospel of John set it apart from the first three Gospels and gave it a little claim as historiography. Griesbach therefore, claimed only the first three Gospels side by side for comparison, or synopsis, meaning view together, and thus introduced what was later to be called the synoptic problem, the question of the order and interrelationships among the three similar accounts. Griesbach's own solution to the problem was to leave Matthew in place as the first gospel, but switch to the order of Mark and Luke, arguing that Mark was an epitome and the last to be written. Others wondered whether it was necessary to switch the order of Mark and Luke, but most agreed that Matthew was first. It seemed right because Mark and Luke had not been apostles, and Matthew's gospel, after all, was the first gospel in the New Testament, wasn't it? Arguments such as these came to halt in the 1830s when, in a flurry of activity, scholars tackled the synoptic problem with renewed determination. By then, it was common scholarly knowledge that the three Gospels shared a significant amount of narrative material, but that Matthew and Luke each contained much material that Mark did not have. Karl Lachmann's 1835 contribution to the solution of this problem was the observation that Matthew and Luke agreed in the order of material in their Gospels only when they followed Mark. When they did not follow Mark, Matthew and Luke frequently went separate ways, even when preparing non Markan material they both shared. Lachmann also noted that the material in Matthew that was not contained in Mark consisted primarily of the sayings of Jesus, a type of material not characteristic of Mark's gospel. Christian Wilk, 1838, drew the obvious conclusion and argued for the priority of Mark, that Mark must have been the earliest of the three gospels and that it was the Markan account upon which both Matthew and Luke were dependent. Putting all the pieces together, Christian Weiss, 1838, proposed the two document hypothesis, namely, that Matthew and Luke composed their Gospels independently, mainly by combining two written sources. One was the Gospel of Mark, the other a source that must have contained the sayings of Jesus. Q had been espied. Despite the logic of the two-source hypothesis, it was not immediately accepted by the scholarly community. The main reason for resistance had less to do with the idea of saying source, however, than a reluctance of acknowledgement, excuse me, than a reluctance to acknowledge the priority of Mark. Preference for Matthew was very strong. Matthew had always enjoyed a position of privilege as the charter for the church. And besides, the Gospel of Matthew is much better suited for the quest of the historical Jesus. Mark was simply too skimpy on the one hand and too miraculous on the other to serve as a basis for a plausible life of Jesus. Matthew was made to order. The portrait of Jesus was more acceptable, the purpose of his teaching seemed clearer, and his life unfolded on cue just as a good biography should. When Albert Schweitzer summarized the Jesus quest at the end of the century and then went on to propose his own life of Jesus, he had no qualms at all about basing his account on the Gospel of Matthew. Even today, there are scholars who continue to resist the two source theory and to favor Matthew as the earliest gospel. But the two document hypothesis answered more questions about textual relations among the three gospels than did the theory of Matthean priority, and thus, as in any scientific field of research, it had to be taken seriously by critical scholars. And it was taken seriously, although progress in demonstrating its superiority was slow. One has to follow the twists and turns of biblical scholarship for about 100 years to see the eventual shift in paradigm that allowed Q to be read as a text in its own right. The list of those who made lasting contributions to the testing and refinement of the hypothesis long and illustrious. H. J. Holtzman put the Q idea to the test in an exhaustive investigation in 1863 and concluded that it was essentially correct. Bernard Weiss, a careful and conservative New Testament scholar, demonstrated Luke's dependence on Q in 1907. In the same year, Adolf von Harnack, the well known historian of early Christianity, actually published a little book called The Sayings of Jesus, English translation 1908, in which for the first time a collection of sayings approximate to Q was published apart from its gospel context. Harnack wanted to see how the teachings of Jesus sounded when divorced from a setting of miracle and myth. By the 1920s, when Rudolf Bultmann and B. H. Streeter each published monumental studies on the synoptic tradition, the two-source hypothesis had largely been accepted by scholars in the liberal tradition. Bultmann used it to establish benchmarks for his history of the synoptic tradition, 1921, and to trace the changes that occurred in individual sayings as the tradition developed. Streeter focused on the manuscript traditions of the Gospels, treat them as a whole literary units, and produced a detailed comparison of each gospel to the others, all the while focusing on the variant readings of each manuscript tradition. Streeter's study has become a classic and has been recognized as establishing the two source hypothesis for the modern period of scholarship. He did this by demonstrating that the two source theory best accounts for both the agreements and the variations in Matthew and Luke at points where each independently used the same source. One might think that after Streeter, scholars would finally turn to Q as the best and earliest evidence for the first chapter of Christian history, but this was not to happen for another half century. At this juncture in the history of Q's discovery, two major obstacles kept the significance of its challenge from coming to fruition. One obstacle was that Q was still thought of mainly as part of the solution to the synoptic problem. Much had been learned about Q, but it was defined solely as a source document for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, not as a text with its own integrity. By now, the standard description was that Q consisted largely of the sayings of Jesus and that its length was at least 225 verses. This judgment was based on the material that appeared in both Matthew and Luke, the so-called minimal text. But Q may have been longer, since Matthew and Luke each contained Q-like material not present in the other gospel. Of the material clearly in common, approximately one half was all but identical. The language of composition was Greek. And when it was seen that Matthew was responsible for arranging much of the Q material into speeches on specific themes, but that Luke presented the same material in two large blocks, one could account for differences in the order of the sayings. In general, the order of Q material in Luke was found to be closer to the original. So, although much has been learned, Q was still mainly considered a collection of isolated sayings. It was far from being recognized as a book of instructions with its own history, much less a charter for a Jesus movement that did not have a narrative gospel. The other major obstacle to an advance in Q studies was that such a definition did not produce a unified text of Q, since it was still firmly embedded in the texts of the two Gospels. Those who wanted to study Q did not have a single text to read, but had to work with a synopsis of the Gospels, comparing readings in two columns, jumping back and ahead to get the sequences straight, and pondering material that may or may not have been part of the original text. Only those having great patience through familiarity with the synoptic tradition, boxes of colored pencils, and a capacity for detailed analysis could even read Q, much less hope to argue for this that refinement of the text or explore its genre, content, and composition. After Streeter's work, Q studies were put on hold while New Testament scholars worked on other questions felt to be more pressing. One question, still unresolved since the turn of the century, threatened the Protestant desire to think of early Christianity as a pure, uncontaminated religion. Study after study had shown that early Christianity was not a unique religion, but had been influenced by the religions of late antiquity. Especially troubling was the similarity of the early Christian message to Jewish apocalyptic thought, a discovery that linked Christianity too closely with Judaism on the one hand and estranged the modern church from its origins on the other. Also unsettling was the discovery that early Christianity bore a distinct resemblance to the Hellenistic mystery cults, particularly where it mattered most, namely in their myths of dying and rising gods and in their rituals of baptism and sacred meals. Whether or not early Christianity differed from the religions of surrounding cultures became a burning issue that diverted attention away from Q and the quest for the historical Jesus. A second question, unresolved since the middle of the 19th century, again surfaced and created even greater scholarly consternation. This was a question of where to locate the foundation of Christian faith in early Christian texts and how to interpret their meaning for modern Christians. Was the core of Christianity to be found in the person of Jesus and his message according to the Gospels, or was it contained in Paul's interpretation of a Christian faith with its focus on proclamation, and in parentheses is a word Kerygma, of the death and resurrection of Jesus? New Testament scholars were not able to say, and they found themselves embarrassed by their uncertainty about the message, quote unquote, at the core of the Christian faith and how that message might be, quote unquote, heard again in the pages of the New Testament today. Finding ways to locate the central message of Christianity was called the hermeneutical, I apologize, question from hermenia or interpretation. And renewed attention to this pursuit consumed New Testament scholarship before and after the Second World War. Bultmann's program for interpreting the New Testament set the pace. He recognized that early Christians were influenced by the world of late antiquity in which they lived and that they expressed themselves in terms of its mythologies. He therefore proposed a program of demythologization or a restatement of the meaning of the early Christian message in language that was not mythological. Bultmann thought that the modern philosophy of existentialism was capable of handling such a translation. According to Bultmann, the message of early Christianity was most profoundly expressed in the Pauline Kerygma and the Gospel of John. Reduced to existential categories, the message was a pronouncement of freedom from one's past and a call to be radically open to one's future. In essence, the Christian message was an invitation to decide in favor of authentic human existence. This unleashed an epoch of unprecedented debate about the reference of religious language in early Christianity. The question of the historical Jesus was simply sidetracked. When the time came to again take up the quest for the historical Jesus, however, more than questions about the influence of the Hellenistic religions and mythological language had to be confronted. A book had been written that created even more havoc than have the hermetical issue. This was Carl Ludwig Schmidt's Der Rahmen der Geschichte. Oh, I apologize, I cannot pronounce that. It's spelled Geschichte, Jesu. In parentheses, the framework of the story of Jesus. A careful study of the way in which the earliest gospel had been composed. In his hands, the Gospel of Mark fell apart and broke up into little pieces, for he was able to show that all the connecting links between the smaller stories in Mark were of Mark's own doing. This study, published in 1919, effectively brought to an end the old quest for the historical Jesus, with its desire for a biography and its unexamined assumption that the basic plot of the narrative Gospels was essentially historical record. With the finding that Mark was responsible for the Gospel plot, all that was left from the time before Mark were fragments of memory traditions, bits and pieces of oral lore, and perhaps a few collections of parables and stories that someone, for reasons as yet unknown, had hung together by theme. So the old dream was in trouble, and new strategies had to be devised if scholars were not going to give up completely the quest for the Christian origins. Three new strategies were developed that continue to be used by scholars today. The first new strategy was called form criticism. If the larger narrative framework of the Gospels was the work of later authors, what about the smaller narrative units from which the Gospels were composed? Why not analyze the forms in which the Jesus traditions were available to the evangelists and ask about their veracity? Perhaps the forms in which these stories were transmitted could tell us how and why they were told. Perhaps some of them would best be explained as memories of things that Jesus had actually said and done. From criticism took the field of New Testament studies by storm. Major works by Bultmann in 1921, Martin Debelius in 1919, and Vincent Taylor in 1933 quickly became standards. An entire generation of New Testament scholars turned to the fragments of the pre gospel Jesus traditions and tried to place them in the earliest stages of Christian memory, if not in the time of Jesus. Parables, miracle stories, pronouncement stories, and small units of sayings were scrutinized to see if any might be imagined as utterances or occurrences in the life of Jesus. Form criticism dominated New Testament scholarship through the period of the Second World War and well into the 1970s. Thus, it was not a time for concentrated studies on Q as a document with its own integrity, much less as an important new window onto the social landscape of the early Jesus movement. Just as the Gospel of Mark had fallen into fragments, so was Q still thought of as a collection of small, isolated sayings. These sayings could be analyzed as forms of speech, to be sure. But form critical analysis also required some social situation or literary context in order to understand the point of an individual saying. Since Q had not been recognized as a literature production, excuse me, since Q had not been recognized as a literary production with its own social history, the sayings did not have such a setting, and thus the study of the sayings in Q could not contribute much to the form critical project. After the war, scholars began to turn their attention to the Gospels as larger units of composition. It was time for putting the pieces back together. Now, the point about the evangelists being responsible for the larger narrative frameworks of the Gospels could finally be turned to advantage. At first, the authors of the Gospels were called redactors or editors, in keeping with the observation that they composed their Gospels by arranging and changing earlier written material. But in spite of the desire not to give the evangelists too much credit as creative writers, real composition was finally acknowledged. Naive assumptions about reporting history vanished, and the authorial intention of the evangelists came to be called a theology. Seeing how an evangelist arranged the pieces for his gospel and thus expressed his theology was called redaction criticism. Scholars learned how to do it, but everyone knew that redaction criticism did not satisfy either the quest for Christian origins or the search for a uh, hermeneutical key to the essence of the Christian message. Redaction criticism merely underscored the fact that early Christians had produced many theologies. It was not long before redaction criticism gave way to a strictly literary criticism informed by contemporary theories of authorship and composition. This happened in America during the 1960s when religious studies were moving away from theological programs to take up residence in the university. Biblical scholars found themselves in conversation with the full range of the human sciences. What seemed important, finally, was to understand the New Testament in the context of the emergence of Christianity as a complex cultural phenomenon. When read against the background of the feisty social histories of the Greco Roman age, early Christian texts quickly lost their glaze of normative theological significance and fell into place as literary achievements, crafted in the rough and tumble of exciting social experimentation. A new array of critical approaches to these texts then created a 20th century excitement of its own. New Testament scholars learned about the discourse, rhetoric, narrative imagination, and the relations of authorship to authority. They explored patterns of social formation, the structures of human societies, the creation of symbolic worlds, and the ways in which myths and rituals worked to forge a group's identity. When used to read the literature produced by early Christians, this new learning brought groups and movements into view that had no place on the older map of Christian beginnings. Q suddenly seemed important for reasons that had nothing to do with solving the synoptic problem. It caught scholarly attention along with a host of extra canonical writings from the early periods of Christian history, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Didache, the Apostolic Fathers, the Coptic Gnostic writings, the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, and the Gospel of Peter. I apologize for any mispronunciations. Q was now on its own, a document from the time before the narrative Gospels were written. Many scholars sensed Q's importance and were eager to take it up for study. Unfortunately, basic work still had to be done. The text had to be established, the literary form of the composition was yet to be determined, and the early history of transmission and composition still needed thorough investigation. Studies that contributed to these endeavors began to appear early in the 1970s, when then flourished during the 1980s and show no signs of stopping. Of critical importance for the study of Q was a reconstruction of the minimal text and some consensus about its composition as a recognizable form of literary activity. Text critical studies have been produced by Siegfried Schultz in 1972, Wolfgang Schenk in 1981, Athanasius Polag in 1982, and Dieter Zeller in 1984. Schultz also provided a synoptic edition of the parallel texts from Matthew and Luke with a German translation. This would have been a great advance except for one feature. He made the mistake of organizing the material by theme and thus erased both the Matthean and Lucan orders. Pollog then offered a reconstruction of Q, published in a study of the sayings by Ivan Havner in 1987. And in 1988, John Kloppenborg published an edition of the Q Parallels in Greek that followed the Lucan order and provided enumerated units, an English translation, and apparatus of scholarly judgments on variant readings, parallels per saying from other early Christian literature, and a Greek concordance. Kloppenberg's Q Parallels is currently the standard text of reference for Q studies in America, but a parallel text is not yet a unified text. To produce a unified text, all of the variant readings must be carefully examined and decisions rendered as to the more original formulation in keeping with a complex set of criteria that includes detailed knowledge of the vocabularies, styles, and ideological preferences of Matthew and Luke as authors. This task is being performed by the International Q Project and the Q Project of the Society of Biblical Literature under the direction of James Robinson at the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity, Claremont. The publication of this project will be a scholarly reconstruction of the Greek text of Q that both Matthew and Luke had at their disposal when writing their Gospels. When this critical text appears, the story of Q's retrieval from the layers of textual history that effectively buried it for so long a time will finally come to a close. With the unified text of Q so close to the surface, coming to terms with its content and composition is already a possibility. The recent excitement over Q has produced a large number of fine studies that acknowledge its integrity and focus on its distinctive contribution to our knowledge of early Christian history. Scholars have been able to identify its genre, elucidate its content, and chart its history of composition. A brief summary of these studies in the next 3 chapters will set the stage for my own translation of Q in part 2. The shards of a lost text have finally been pieced together. And this reading was from part 1, Finding the Shards, from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Thank you for listening.